The Rise and Fall of Julius Caesar. Introduction: the immortal name. There are few names in human history that echo through the centuries with such power that they become more than names. They become titles. Caesar. Long after the man himself lay in his grave, his name was reborn in distant lands and distant ages. The emperors of Rome carried it as a badge of power. Centuries later, rulers in Germany called themselves Kaisers. In Russia, the word transformed into Tsar. To be a Caesar meant to be more than a king. It meant to rule with a weight of authority that stretched across borders, across generations, across the world. But behind the legend, behind the marble statues and the stories of glory, was a man born into political chaos, raised in danger, and hardened by ambition. A man who could recite poetry to pirates while plotting their execution. A man who commanded armies, seduced queens, bent the Roman Republic to his will, and yet, on one fateful day, fell to the knives of his closest allies. Gaius Julius Caesar was not the first ambitious Roman, nor the last. But he was the one who shattered the fragile balance of the Republic forever. His story is one of brilliance and brutality, loyalty and betrayal, love and power. It is the story of how a single man rose so high that Rome itself could no longer contain him. Over the next hour, we will walk through Caesar's life, from the dangerous streets of Republican Rome, to the forests of Gaul, to the burning sands of Egypt, and finally to the Senate floor on the Ides of March. We will meet his allies, his enemies, his soldiers, and his lovers. And we will ask, what was it about this man that made him unforgettable? The world remembers emperors and kings, generals and conquerors. But Julius Caesar became more than a man. He became a word, and words are immortal. Chapter 1: Rome before Caesar. To understand Caesar, we must first understand the Rome he inherited. The year is 100 BC. The Roman Republic is the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. Its armies had conquered Greece, crushed Carthage, and subdued Spain. Its fleets dominated the seas, and its governors ruled over provinces from the mountains of Macedonia to the deserts of North Africa. Rome was rich, mighty, and feared, but Rome was also rotting. Wealth poured into the city, but it did not flow evenly. Vast fortunes went to senators and generals. The common people, the plebeians, often lived in poverty, crowded into Insulae, the towering apartment blocks of Rome. Grain shortages and unemployment fueled unrest. The Senate, once the guardian of Republican tradition, had become a battlefield for ambitious men. Bribery was rampant, elections were manipulated, and politicians often hired street gangs to intimidate rivals. Roman politics was no longer the dignified debate of noble citizens. It was street brawls, mobs, and blood. And then there were the generals. The Republic had created a monster. Its armies were loyal not to the state, but to the men who led them. Soldiers swore oaths not to Rome, but to their commanders. A clever general could promise them land, wealth, and glory, and in return, receive loyalty stronger than any law. In the generation before Caesar, this truth had already torn Rome apart. Gaius Marius, a popular general, had risen to immense power by recruiting poor men into the army. His rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marched on Rome itself, seizing power by force. Civil war raged. Proscriptions, lists of enemies of the state, meant that any Roman could wake up one day to find himself declared an outlaw, his property confiscated, his life forfeit. By the time Caesar was born, the Republic was sick. The ideals of liberty, shared power, and rule by law were collapsing under the weight of ambition and greed. Rome was still powerful but unstable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Into this world came a child named Gaius Julius Caesar. Chapter 2: A Dangerous Childhood. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC into the ancient patrician family of the Julii. The Julii claimed descent from Iulus, the son of the Trojan prince Aeneas, who in turn was said to be the son of Venus herself. This divine ancestry would later serve Caesar well. A man descended from gods could hardly be considered ordinary. But while his family was noble, it was not especially rich. Caesar was not born into immense wealth, but he was born into powerful political connections. His mother, Aurelia, came from a respected family, and through her, Caesar was linked to the faction of the populares, politicians who claimed to fight for the rights of the common people against the conservative aristocracy known as the Optimates. Caesar's early years were shaped by one of Rome's bloodiest periods, the dictatorship of Sulla. When Sulla seized control of Rome, he purged his enemies. Thousands were killed in the streets, their property seized. Caesar, still a young man, was directly threatened. Sulla ordered him to divorce his wife, Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Sulla's greatest enemies. Most men would have obeyed. Caesar refused. This was an act of breathtaking defiance. A teenager standing up to the most powerful man in Rome. Sulla relented reluctantly. He is said to have remarked, "In this young man, there are many Mariuses." It was a chilling prophecy. He recognized in Caesar the same dangerous ambition that had nearly destroyed him years earlier. But Caesar's refusal made him a marked man. His property was confiscated, his life at risk. He fled Rome and joined the army, serving in Asia Minor. There he distinguished himself for bravery, once saving the life of a fellow soldier and earning the civic crown, one of Rome's highest military honors. It was the beginning of a career that would blend politics and war, charm and ruthlessness. Caesar had survived Sulla's terror, and in doing so, proved that he was no ordinary Roman noble. He was something far more dangerous, a survivor who refused to bend. Chapter 3: Caesar and the Pirates. One of the most famous stories from Caesar's early life shows both his arrogance and his audacity. While traveling in the Aegean Sea around 75 BC, Caesar's ship was attacked by Cilician pirates, notorious raiders who preyed on Roman shipping. The young nobleman was captured. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed in their faces. 20? Do you know who I am? Demand 50. They agreed, amused by his boldness. While his companions sailed to gather the ransom, Caesar lived among his captors for more than a month. But this was no ordinary hostage. Caesar treated the pirates not as masters, but as subordinates. He joined in their games, recited poetry and speeches to them, and scolded them whenever they failed to applaud. He ordered them to keep quiet when he wanted to sleep. The pirates, half amused and half baffled, obeyed. And yet, throughout his captivity, Caesar made one promise again and again. "When I am free," he said, "I will return, and I will crucify every one of you." The pirates laughed, but Caesar was not joking. When the ransom was paid, he was released. Immediately, he raised a fleet, hunted down the pirates, and captured them. True to his word, he had them all crucified. But in an act of calculated mercy, or perhaps calculated theater, he ordered their throats cut before the execution to spare them prolonged suffering. This story reveals Caesar in full, arrogant, theatrical, utterly ruthless, and yet careful to shape how the world perceived him. Even in his 20s, he was already performing for history. Chapter 4: Rise to Power. When Caesar returned from his adventures at sea, he knew one thing: power in Rome could not be seized by sword alone. A Roman noble had to climb the cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices that defined a man's career. It began with the quaestorship, then the aedileship, then the praetorship, and finally, if fortune smiled, the consulship, the highest office in the republic. But this ladder was not climbed by talent alone. It required allies, money, and above all, the love of the Roman people. Caesar possessed all three. He was a natural orator. His voice, sharp and commanding, could sway a crowd like music. He had studied rhetoric in Rhodes under the finest teachers, and in the Forum, where Rome's citizens gathered daily, he could hold thousands spellbound. Unlike many nobles, he spoke not only to senators but to the common people, the plebs. He promised them justice, bread, and entertainment. And entertainment he gave them. As Edile, Caesar staged extravagant games and festivals. Gladiator fights, chariot races, theatrical performances, all paid for with borrowed money. He sank himself deep into debt, but in Rome, debt could be forgiven. Popularity, however, could not be bought so cheaply. Caesar knew that spectacle was an investment. Every cheer in the arena was another step on the ladder of power. At the same time, he cultivated allies in the Senate. He charmed, flattered, and negotiated, always seeking connections. He understood that Roman politics was not about law, but about relationships. His debts grew, but so did his reputation. Rome now spoke of him as a man destined for greatness. He had charisma, audacity, and the favor of the people. But Caesar understood something else too. Rome was no longer ruled by laws and offices alone. It was ruled by power blocks. And if he wanted to reach the top, he would need powerful friends. Chapter 5. The First Triumvirate. In 60 BC, Caesar forged an alliance that would shake Rome to its core. It became known as the First Triumvirate, though at the time it was little more than an informal pact. The three men could not have been more different. Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, the most celebrated general of his age, adored by his soldiers, feared by his enemies. He had conquered the East, destroyed pirates, and returned to Rome in glory. But the Senate had denied him land for his veterans, and resentment burned in his heart. A Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. His fortune was legendary, built on land speculation, business, and ruthless opportunism. He had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus but longed for military glory to match his wealth. Gaius Julius Caesar, ambitious, charming, and deeply in debt. He needed money, power, and allies to secure the consulship. Alone, each man was formidable. Together, they were unstoppable. The triumvirate was sealed not only by politics but by family. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia, binding the two with blood. Crassus provided financial support, easing Caesar's debts. Caesar, in turn, used his influence with the people to pass laws favoring his partners. In 59 BC, Caesar became consul. His year in office was marked by bold reforms: land for Pompey's veterans, economic policies to favor Crassus, and laws to curb corruption. The Senate resisted, but Caesar was relentless. When opponents tried to block him, he took his proposals directly to the comitia, the popular assemblies. By the end of his consulship, Caesar had secured for himself an even greater prize: the governorship of Gaul. What seemed at first a distant, difficult posting would soon become the foundation of his legend. Chapter 6. The Gallic Wars. For nearly a decade, Caesar waged war in Gaul, a vast region stretching across modern France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. To the Romans, Gaul was a land of fierce tribes, rich resources, and constant rebellion. To Caesar, it was an opportunity. The Gallic Wars were more than battles. They were Caesar's stage. He recorded them himself in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War, written in clear, simple Latin, always in the third person. These works presented Caesar as both a humble servant of Rome and a genius of strategy. In truth, they were propaganda, dispatches meant to glorify his victories and justify his conquests. But the victories were real. Caesar fought dozens of tribes, using discipline, engineering, and speed to overwhelm his enemies. His legions built bridges across rivers in days, marched incredible distances, and besieged cities with astonishing efficiency. The most famous of his foes was Vercingetorix, a chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix united the Gauls in a massive revolt against Rome in 52 BC. For a moment, it seemed as though Caesar might finally be defeated. The decisive battle came at Alesia. Vercingetorix fortified himself in a stronghold on a hill. Caesar, rather than assault it, built an enormous ring of fortifications around the city. Miles of walls, trenches, and towers. When Gallic reinforcements came to rescue their leader, Caesar built a second ring of defenses facing outward. His army stood between two walls, besieging the enemy while simultaneously defending against a larger force. The fighting was desperate, but Caesar's men held. In the end, Vercingetorix surrendered, riding out on horseback in full armor before dismounting and laying his sword at Caesar's feet. The Gallic Wars brought Caesar unimaginable wealth. He looted treasure, sold captives into slavery, and enriched his soldiers with spoils. By his own account, he killed or enslaved more than 1 million Gauls. But perhaps more dangerous than gold was loyalty. Caesar's army had fought with him for years. They were not just soldiers of Rome, they were Caesar's men. They adored him, trusted him, and would follow him anywhere. And soon, he would ask them to follow him into Italy itself, against Rome. Chapter 7, the Rubicon. By 50 BC, Caesar stood at the height of his power. His victories in Gaul had made him the most celebrated general in Rome. His soldiers were loyal, his coffers full, his fame unmatched. But with fame came fear. In Rome, his old alliance, the first triumvirate, had crumbled. Crassus was dead, slain in the disastrous campaign against the Parthians in the east. Pompey, once his ally and son-in-law, had drifted toward the Senate and the conservative Optimates. Now Pompey was Rome's protector, given extraordinary powers by a Senate terrified of Caesar's ambition. And ambition was something Caesar never bothered to hide. The Senate ordered him to lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. But Caesar knew the truth. The moment he stepped off the stage, his enemies would destroy him. They would prosecute him for corruption, strip him of honors, and exile him, or worse. The choice was stark: surrender everything or seize everything. In January of 49 BC, Caesar marched south with the 13th Legion. His path led to a small river in northern Italy, the Rubicon. Roman law was clear: no general could cross the Rubicon with an army. To do so was treason, an act of war against the Republic itself. Caesar paused at the riverbank. His officers urged caution. They reminded him that if he crossed, there would be no turning back. Civil war would be inevitable. According to legend, Caesar hesitated only briefly before speaking the words that have echoed through history. Alia iacta est. The die is cast. With that, he stepped into the water. The Rubicon was not a wide river. In less than a minute, his horse splashed through to the other side. But symbolically, the crossing was immense. In that moment, the Roman Republic itself was doomed. Civil war had begun. Chapter 8, Caesar versus Pompey. The news of Caesar's march sent shockwaves through Rome. Senators panicked, many fleeing the city with Pompey. The treasury was hastily emptied, records abandoned. Caesar entered Rome not as a conqueror but as a man walking into an empty theater. The capital had been abandoned by its rulers. But Pompey was no fool. He had no desire to fight Caesar on Italian soil. Instead, he withdrew to the east, where he could gather troops from Rome's allies and provinces. There, he could assemble an army far larger than Caesar's. Caesar knew he had to act quickly. He raced first to Spain, where Pompey's lieutenants commanded powerful legions. With astonishing speed, Caesar defeated them, securing the west before turning east to face Pompey himself. In 48 BC, the two armies met in Greece, on the plain of Pharsalus. Pompey commanded nearly 45,000 men, twice Caesar's numbers. The Senate believed victory was certain. But Caesar's genius was not in numbers, but in strategy. He used discipline and cunning to turn Pompey's advantage against him. At the height of battle, Caesar unleashed a hidden reserve of soldiers who struck Pompey's cavalry at the flank, throwing his army into chaos. When the dust settled, Caesar had won a stunning victory. Pompey fled, his once mighty army shattered. He sought refuge in Egypt, hoping for sanctuary. But Egypt was ruled by the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, and the pharaoh's advisors saw an opportunity. If they delivered Pompey's head to Caesar, perhaps they could win his favor. On the shore, as Pompey stepped from his ship, he was betrayed. A dagger plunged into his back. His severed head was presented to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, upon seeing it, wept. Pompey had been his ally, his rival, his son-in-law through marriage to Julia. Now he was a mutilated corpse. The old world of the Republic was dying, and Caesar, though victorious, was left with ashes. But Egypt had more to offer him than the memory of Pompey. Chapter 9: Caesar and Cleopatra. Egypt in 48 BC was a kingdom of intrigue and luxury, wealth and danger. Its ruler, Ptolemy XIII, was little more than a boy, guided by ambitious advisors. But his sister, Cleopatra, was a force to be reckoned with. Cleopatra was in exile when Caesar arrived in Alexandria. She knew that if she could win Caesar's support, she could reclaim her throne. But how could she reach him, trapped in the palace by her brother's men? Legend tells us the story. Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's chambers, rolled inside a carpet. When the bundle was unrolled before him, out stepped the young queen, radiant and fearless. Caesar was captivated. Whether it was her intelligence, her charm, or her sheer audacity, Cleopatra enchanted him. The two became lovers and allies. With Caesar's legions, Cleopatra defeated her brother's forces in the Alexandrian War. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, and Cleopatra was restored as queen. Their relationship was more than passion. It was politics. By supporting Cleopatra, Caesar secured Rome's grain supply from Egypt, the wealth of the Nile, and a powerful ally in the east. Cleopatra bore him a son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion. Together, they sailed along the Nile in a golden barge, presenting themselves as new incarnations of Isis and Osiris. For the people of Egypt, it was divine theater. For the senators of Rome, it was scandal. Rumors spread that Caesar intended to make himself king, ruling Rome with Cleopatra at his side. For Romans who despised monarchy, the whispers were poison. But Caesar was not concerned. He returned to Rome with Cleopatra at his side, parading his victories and consolidating his power. The Republic was his to command. Chapter 10: Dictator for Life. When Caesar returned to Rome after the wars in Egypt and the East, he was no longer simply a victorious general. He was the master of the Roman world. He celebrated a series of triumphs, grand parades that dazzled the city. Captives marched in chains, treasures from Gaul and Egypt glittered in the sun. Exotic animals paraded before the crowds. It was theater on a scale Rome had never seen. Caesar basked in the glory, presenting himself not merely as a commander, but as the savior of the Republic. But what was left of the Republic? The Senate granted him extraordinary honors. Statues of Caesar appeared among those of the gods. His portrait was stamped on coins, something no living Roman had ever dared. He was declared Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Caesar also pursued reforms. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, a system so precise that it remains the foundation of the calendar we use today. He granted citizenship to many in the provinces, expanded the Senate, launched building projects, and enacted debt relief. For the common people, Caesar was generous. Bread was distributed, games were frequent, and opportunities were opened. For the elite, however, his power was intolerable. The Republic had always prided itself on its hatred of kings. Even the word rex, king, was an insult in Rome. Yet here was Caesar, clothed in purple, wearing laurel crowns, seated on a golden chair. He had not taken the title of king, but in the eyes of many, he was one already. To some, he was a visionary reformer. To others, he was a tyrant. And in whispers behind closed doors, senators began to plot his death. Chapter 11, the Ides of March. The conspirators struck on March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March. It was a day like any other. Caesar had ignored warnings from soothsayers who urged him to beware the date. His wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of blood and begged him not to go. But Caesar, dismissing superstition, made his way to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting. Inside, more than 60 senators waited, daggers hidden beneath their togas. Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, the man Caesar trusted like a son. As Caesar entered, he was surrounded. Senator Tullius Cimber approached with a petition. When Caesar waved him aside, Cimber grabbed his toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. This was the signal. The first dagger struck, then another, and another. Caesar struggled, fighting back with his bare hands. Blood poured across the marble floor. He turned, seeing familiar faces twisted with hatred. And then he saw Brutus. According to tradition, his final words were, "Et Brute, then fall Caesar." Whether he truly spoke them, we cannot know. But in that moment, he ceased resisting. He pulled his toga over his head and collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, the man he had once defeated, as though the Republic itself demanded justice. 23 stab wounds ended the life of Rome's greatest general. The senators believed they had saved the Republic. Instead, they had destroyed it. Chapter 12, the legacy of Caesar. When the conspirators emerged from the Senate, they expected cheers, celebrations, a restored republic. Instead, they were met with silence. The Roman people did not rejoice. They mourned. Caesar's funeral became a turning point. His friend Mark Antony delivered a fiery eulogy, displaying Caesar's blood-stained toga before the crowd. He reminded them of Caesar's generosity, his conquests, his plans for Rome. The people erupted in fury, rioting in the streets, burning the homes of the conspirators. The Republic was finished. Caesar's assassination did not restore liberty. It unleashed new civil wars. Within a generation, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, would become Rome's first emperor. Caesar himself was declared a god, worshipped as Divus Julius. Temples were built in his honor. The name Caesar became a title carried by emperors for centuries. His reforms shaped the empire that followed. His calendar endures to this day. His writings, especially the Gallic Wars, remain masterpieces of Latin prose. His example of ambition, brilliance, and ruthlessness continues to inspire and to warn. Above all, his life is a lesson. The Republic could not contain his ambition, and his ambition could not escape betrayal. He rose higher than any Roman before him, but the higher he climbed, the greater the fall. Closing words. The story of Julius Caesar is not just Roman history. It is a mirror for every age. It tells us how ambition can build and destroy, how power can inspire and corrupt, how loyalty can turn to betrayal. Caesar lived only 55 years. Yet, in that short time, he changed the course of Western civilization. He toppled an ancient republic and laid the foundations for an empire that would dominate the world for centuries. He was a soldier, a statesman, a lover, and a tyrant. A man who dined with pirates, crossed forbidden rivers, marched through the snows of Gaul, and dreamed of remaking Rome. And though daggers cut him down on the Senate floor, they could not destroy his legacy. His name lives on, carved into the very language of kings and emperors. Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar. The man became a word, and words are immortal.